Hello and welcome back to my Safety Hub. I'm Occupational and today we'll be discussing the risk assessment methodology from Safety Wallet. This is a two-part series in which we will be discussing the theoretical approach with regards to the risk assessment methodology, and secondly, the practical application of the risk assessment methodology in the workplace to make sure that everybody is safe from harm. At its core, the risk assessment methodology is aimed at identifying hazards as well as mitigating the associated risks to those hazards by the application of control measures necessary to reduce such risk. This process is not only a regulatory requirement, but is also a proactive approach towards ensuring a safe workplace for all. Before we move forward, we need to understand the main differences between risk assessment and risk management. Risk management looks at the holistic approach towards making sure that the workplace is safe for all. Risk assessment is a part of such risk management processes where hazards are identified, risks are identified, and control measures are identified for application within the risk management process. Ultimately, we have to recognize that risk management and risk assessment is aimed at one thing, and that's to prohibit or avoid the possible consequences that have been identified or that are linked with the risks that stem from the risk assessment. Now, specifically a risk assessment is a systematic approach towards the identification of possible hazards, the association of risks to those hazards, and then to determine the possible likelihood of these risks becoming a reality, along with the possible consequences associated to those risks. We then have to go through the process of associating the control measures necessary to mitigate or eliminate these risks completely. Now that we've established the hazards and risks and the possible harm that they can cause to employees and others in the workplace, we have to prioritize these risks so to be sure where to place our focus first. This is done so that we can protect not only the most important or valuable assets in the business, but also to mitigate the risks which are most likely to occur and result in major damage. We have to remember that a risk assessment is not a once-off approach towards resolving or solving the health and safety issues you may have in the business. It's a continuous, systematic approach towards health and safety, which means that your risk assessment document is a live document which has to be referred to continually, which has to be revised continually, and adopted and improved on continually, so that whatever evolving risks or hazards may emerge from the workplace can be controlled as time moves by. Now, as I've mentioned before, the final outcome that we're looking for when we conduct risk assessment or risk management practices is the elimination or the control of the possible negative consequences that stem from these risks. We have to keep in mind, though, that risk management is impossible without a risk assessment. And from a legislative point of view, your risk assessment will enable you to initiate and put into place whatever control measures are legislated to be put into place in the workplace. Therefore, legislation such as the Occupational Health and Safety Act and its regulations, along with the standards that we apply, will then ensure the safety of your employees if these risk assessment practices are put into place through effective risk management. Next, let's have a look at some of the definitions that you would have to work with when conducting a risk assessment. First off, let's have a look at what is a hazard. A hazard is defined as anything that has the potential to cause harm. Examples of this could be sharp objects, moving machinery, electricity, radiation, chemicals, or even biological agents. Next, let's consider risk. Risk can be defined as the likelihood that the possible harm from the hazards will occur. Once hazards have been identified, we need to connect these hazards to risks by implementing what we call risk statements in your risk assessment. A risk assessment statement will have 4 parts. Part 1 of the statement will involve the hazard itself, bringing it into context of the task or activity being performed. The second part of your risk statement gives a description of the task or activity being performed. The third part of your risk statement will give the causal effect of the hazard after it's been made contact with by the person that's performing the task or activity. And finally, part 4, or the last part of your risk statement, will give a description of the possible consequences that have come to fruition or may come to fruition once you've made contact with the hazard. Possible consequences can include first, second, or third degree burns, lacerations, fractures, and even death. An example of such a risk description could be an employee who works on a ladder at a level of 1.5 meters, who gets distracted and falls to the ground, resulting in possible sprains, strains, fractures, and possible death. It's important that we mention these consequences in terms of their levels of severity, as it has a direct impact on the risk quantification and obviously the level of risk associated with a task or activity. We will discuss more about this later. This episode is brought to you by Occupational and Safety Wallet. Occupational is the leading health and safety software available to all employers in South Africa. With tools such as electronic appointment letter generation, mobile inspections for less paperwork, recording of incidents and accidents, and the Safety Wallet supplier directory, Occupational is the most comprehensive health and safety software available. Visit www.safetywallet.co.za to find out how Occupational and Safety Wallet can assist you today. Next, we have to consider the definition of a control measure, which can be seen as an action or a systematic approach for controlling risk or eliminating risk completely. Control measures need to be combined or used in conjunction with one another, so to make sure that the hazard, its associated consequences, and therefore its risk, never reaches the employee, persons, or processes. These form layers which protect us and our businesses from harm. Next, let's have a look at the development, implementation, and monitoring of control measures necessary to control risk. First off, we have to recognize that the first type of risk that we work with is called pure risk. This is risk that has been identified but has no associated controls with it. We associate control measures to move from pure risk to controlled risk, and hopefully, in some cases, eliminated risk, which means that the control measures are so effective that the risk itself no longer exists. To consider effective control measures, we have to refer to the hierarchy of control, which is typically shown in the form or shape of a pyramid, where the most effective control measure will be at the top of the pyramid and the least effective control measure will be at the bottom of the pyramid. The least effective control measure that we refer to, and we always have to do in the last instance, is personal protective equipment. The first control measure we have to consider is always the elimination of risk, which unfortunately isn't always the most practical approach towards controlling risk, as businesses may depend on processes or substances or materials for their existence, and therefore such hazards cannot be eliminated completely. Let's just fill out the rest of the pyramid before we talk about these types of controls a little bit more in depth. If elimination isn't completely possible, we need to try and substitute the hazard with other materials or substances or processes which makes the work safer. If it's not possible to do this entirely, we need to consider engineering controls, which again will present or create barriers between the workers or the possible assets and the form or shape of harm. Lastly, we need to consider administrative controls. These include things like training and certificates, which again need to be administrated by individuals which are competent to do so, to further create other forms of barriers or forms of resistance between the risk or the hazard and the individual himself. Let's quickly run through the hierarchy of control and its pyramid, just to make sure that we cover its concepts effectively. Elimination is focused on eliminating the risk completely, which may include eliminating the hazard or process completely as well. Substitution is focused on substituting the process, the materials, or the hazards completely with other substances, materials, or processes, which may make the work a lot safer. Again, just like with elimination, this isn't always as practical as it can be, as your business may depend on such substances or processes for its effectiveness. Engineering controls are focused on placing a physical barrier between the employees or persons performing the work and the source of harm. This may mean that a work process may become longer or even a little bit more technical due to the fact that these engineering controls need to be initiated or activated when the work is being performed, but they do create a space where risk is controlled. This may include installing ventilation systems or machine guards, which protects employees from the source of danger. As mentioned before, administrative controls are just above personal protective equipment in the hierarchy of controls. Now, as the words mention, administrative controls are all focused on the paperwork that needs to be done to make sure that our systems and processes are in place to make sure that our risks are controlled effectively. However, administrative controls also require persons with higher levels of competency to make sure that these control measures themselves or actions are carried out effectively. These actions include training, certificates of compliance, safe operator procedure training, induction training, or even specific work training that needs to take place. Other administrative controls include things like appointment letters, hygiene surveys, and safety signage. Last but not least, let's have a look at personal protective equipment. Now, we have to keep in mind that personal protective equipment is the last resort. However, just because it's seen as the last resort, personal protective equipment cannot be ignored from the risk control process. It is purely seen as the last resort due to the fact that there is existing risk or controlled risk, which may mean that such risk can still take place. In other words, that a person can still make contact with the source of harm or the hazard. The PPE is purely there to try and protect the individual from the energy being released should the hazard be made contact with, and to try and lessen the impact on the individual's body or themselves when the hazard is being released. Now, let's have a look at a task-based risk assessment which is performed by Safety Wallet. Thank you again to Safety Wallet for making this video possible. A task-based risk assessment is a specific approach towards risk analysis, which looks at tasks and activities being performed at the workplace and therefore focusing on the control measures that need to be implemented to make sure that risk is controlled and that employees remain safe. In my opinion, a task-based risk assessment is highly effective. It does require specific and continuous analysis of risks and hazards, and therefore, again, I have to highlight the fact that a risk assessment is not something that can be conducted and shelved. A task-based risk assessment is more specific than a general risk assessment. It analyzes every task and activity, looking at all the steps, materials, or resources being used in such tasks or activities, and therefore also considers all possible hazards and risks associated to those hazards, to be able to implement or at least identify the control measures for implementation during risk management. A task-based risk assessment requires you to, first of all, identify and define all tasks and activities that are being performed at the workplace. Secondly, to define and identify all hazards associated with a list of tasks and activities that you've created. This can include any hazard, biological, chemical, physical, and these hazards have to be listed and associated to these tasks and activities, so to be able to associate the risks to them, which will follow. The third step requires you to analyze and associate the risks to these hazards that you've identified for every task and activity. This involves assessing the likelihood and the severity of these risks associated to the hazards. Step number 4 requires the evaluation of risk levels, therefore to determine if further control measures may be required to mitigate the risk. This may mean that we need to draw a comparison between legal requirements, best practices, or company thresholds related to risk. Step number 5 will determine whether risk is at an acceptable level. Here we will identify and determine the controls necessary to mitigate the risk. Therefore, we would need to consider elimination, substitution, engineering controls, administrative controls, as well as personal protective equipment. Step number 6 looks at the administration or the recording of the information that has been identified. This is a legal requirement, and it also becomes a reference point for future use, as your risk assessment is a live document that needs to be considered continually. The recordings that you've made, therefore the risk assessment that you've completed, can then be used to conduct training, as well as to influence or inform other individuals of the potential risk of tasks or activities being performed in the workplace. Step number 7 looks at informing all stakeholders of the risks or hazards, as well as the control measures associated to the risk assessment. The document that you've recorded, therefore, becomes imperative in making sure that everybody understands these risks and hazards. We also have to make sure that we keep evidence of such communication to these different stakeholders. Step number 8 looks at the continuous or regular review of your risk assessment. Now, as I've mentioned before, a risk assessment is not a stagnant or static item that remains on a bookshelf. It's something that needs to be considered continually. In fact, as work progresses, hazards may change, risk levels go up and down, and therefore your risk assessment document remains a live document. Before we move on, let's quickly have a look at the difference between a task or activity, which you may have noticed I've mentioned a few times during this recording. Let's start with a task. A task is a specific action which will have specific steps which needs to be carried out for its completion to reach an objective. An activity is a collection of tasks which are combined for a specific objective, which could be seen as routine or non-routine. As an example of this, let's have a look at the storage of chemicals, which can be seen as an activity. Now, within this activity, there are a range of tasks that need to be carried out. The chemicals need to be placed on the shelf. They need to be labeled. They need to be segregated in such a way that they cannot cause automatic combustion between one another. These are the tasks to be carried out. And these tasks have specific steps to be carried out. And naturally, as we've discussed before, these activities or tasks will have different hazards and risks associated to them, but they're very related to each other. Making the distinction between activities and tasks and how they relate to each other is important for an effective risk assessment to be completed. By identifying the broader activities and their constituent tasks, we would be able to more accurately identify hazards, risks, and the required controls to manage such risks. To quantify or to assess risk, you would need a tool or a risk assessment calculator to determine what the levels of risk are, which you would need to control. In the calculator used with the safety wallet task-based risk assessment, we consider two main factors: severity and probability. The severity rankings within the calculator used by the Safety Wallet Task-Based Risk Assessment has 5 different levels. Each level will look at different implications, or call it consequences, focused on personal harm, environmental harm, or financial harm to the business. The 5 levels of severity used in this calculator starts with the least impactful, which is noticeable risk. Next, we have important risk, followed by serious, very serious, and disastrous risk, which would naturally include multiple fatalities. As I've mentioned before, the calculator will consider 2 main components, the second of which is the likelihood component. Here we look at the chance of which the risk will actually become a reality. Again, there are 5 different levels that need to be considered here. The first of the levels is looking at conceivable risk. In other words, it's a conceivable chance that this incident may take place. Usually it's a 1 in 1,000 chance. Next, we look at remotely possible. So here we're looking at a chance of the incident happening at a case of being a 1 in 100. The next level looks at an unusual but possible chance that the incident would take place. So it's basically a 1 out of 10 shot. The fourth level looks at a likely chance that the incident would take place. Here we're saying it's a 50-50 chance of the incident becoming a reality. The final level of probability looks at an almost certain chance of the incident taking place, building up to 100%, making sure that we cover this incident or the probability of it taking place more seriously. Now that we've determined the probability and the severity associated with the hazards that we've identified, we need to quantify risk. To do this, we take the 2 main parts of probability and severity and we multiply them with each other. In doing this, we would actually have results which, according to your risk calculator or the tool that I've mentioned before, will give you a risk level associated to the task or activity that you are analyzing. Now, once you've multiplied these numbers with each other, we need to name the risk levels that we have identified, so that we can more seriously associate the control measures to them, and also in doing so make sure that these control measures are appropriately implemented. There are 5 different levels of risk that we identify from this multiplication or analysis that we're busy completing. They are low risk, possible risk, substantial risk, high risk, and critical risk. Critical risk can only be reached when you multiply severity and possibility with each other at a maximum of 5 times 5, giving you a critical risk level of 25, meaning that whatever task or activity is being performed needs urgent and serious attention. On the Safety Wallet Task-Based Risk Assessment calculator, low risk will be associated with a score of 1 to 3. Possible risk will be associated with risk levels between 4 and 11. Substantial risk is associated with risk levels between 12 and 14. High risk has risk levels associated to it of 15 to 24. And naturally critical risk is 25. Now on the calculator itself, these risk levels will have indicators telling you what to do in terms of the application of controls, or at least to consider control measures with regards to these risk levels. As an example, low risk will give you an indication to simply monitor the task or activity being performed to make sure that whatever control measures are already in place or whatever task is being performed, that it gets performed according to its prescriptions. A high risk or critical risk will most probably give you an indication in telling you that you would need to substitute, eliminate, or transfer any of the associated hazards, materials, or processes in such a way that you would be able to minimize the risk fully or to a tolerable level. This concludes the first part of our series covering the risk assessment methodology, specifically from Safety Wallet. In our next episode, we'll be delving into more specifics or practical examples for the application of this methodology. If you found this video insightful, please feel free to subscribe, like, comment, and share the video, as this greatly helps the channel. Also, please feel free to click on the bell icon to get reminders or notifications as to when our new content will be released. Remember, stay safe, stay inspired, and until next time, take care.